All right, welcome back to another episode of Life in the Stands podcast with Jake and Zach. Today we have a NBA focused show for the most part. We're going to talk some free agency stuff, a little bit with the NFL, but then we're going to get into a lot of the exciting things happening in the NBA. But for the start of it, we're going to jump right into the NBA or the NFL free agency QB carousel that's going on a little bit. Bender, there's been a lot of talk about where some of these high ticket NFL QBs are going to end up in the offseason. There's a couple of names that are definitely sticking out. Jimmy G, Lamar Jackson, Derek Carr. Where do you think some of these guys are going to end up? Let's start with Jimmy G. He spent the year with the Niners, had a good little run, and then had a section of the year where the Niners played with Brock Purdy, had a section with Trey Lance. I don't think Jimmy G's really been mentioned as the QB they're going to go back to this year. Where do you think he's going to end up? What do you think is going to happen with that situation?
Yeah, so to start, I feel bad for him, to be honest. The injury does not help, but I do think he deserves a little bit more respect for what he did with the Niners in his tenure there. But I do see him going to the New York Jets. I think being a game manager type quarterback that he is, I think fitting in with that defense would, again, make him look like he did on the Niners because the Niners
Mm-hmm.
always carried with the defense. I do believe Brees Hall coming back will help. I think that's a name people forget. He played really well at the beginning of the year when the Jets were actually winning some games and actually at the top
Yeah,
of their division.
yeah.
So that's where I think he'll land. I think they need another wideout. I do like Elijah Moore and those kinds of guys or Garrett Wilson,
Mm-hmm.
but they don't really utilize them as much. Maybe that
Yeah.
changes with Jimmy G, but we'll see.
Feels like feels like they need one more weapon though. Yeah.
Yeah. So next quarterback I want to talk about is Lamar.
Mm-hmm.
I think he'll get paid when it's all said and done. I know there's a bunch of drama about it now, but I think at the end of the day, Harbaugh is going to be like, "Hey, look, who else are we going to play with? Like,
Yeah.
what Huntley's their backup? Like,
Yeah. Well, and that whole team, like all the roster moves they've made, all the draft, like the drafting and those decisions that they've made, it's all to fit around Lamar's style of play. So like they're into it at this point. It's going to take a long time to dig themselves back out of that kind of a roster build if they decide not to pay him, which it just makes no sense.
yeah." And I think drafting J.K. Dobbins was a big deal, and I know he keeps getting hurt, but when he was healthy at the end of the year, why are
Hmm.
you not using him? Like, I feel like the Ravens also don't know how to use their players. You want to be a run heavy and defense type of team. That's typically how they
Hmm.
play, and like try to put it on the back of Lamar and
Yeah.
whatnot. But you kind of need to give him a break.
Hmm.
Obviously, like if you keep running him, you're bound to get hurt at some point. You see it with Josh Allen.
Yeah.
You see
Yeah.
it with Jalen Hurts with his shoulder, who missed a couple of games.
Yeah.
So I think you need to kind of lay back on that and kind of depend on some other guys. Not saying don't
Hmm.
use him,
Hmm.
because I was a believer in Jalen Hurts needed to be used more in the second half of that Super Bowl.
Yeah.
So I think you need to find the right balance, and I think you need at least one more acquisition in the pass game that's not just Mark Andrews.
Yeah.
He tends to get hurt a good bit.
Hmm.
They tried with guys like Sammy Watkins and whoever else
Yeah.
they decided to bring in,
Des
but
Bryant,
those,
Deshaun Jackson. Like they've tried a
yeah,
couple of veteran wide receivers. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So, what are your thoughts on Jimmy G and Lamar, real quick?
Yeah. Well, before I jump into that too, to stay on that Ravens conversation too, since being a Steelers fan, I keep up to date on my Ravens stuff since they're in the same division. And the Ravens also are bringing in a new offensive coordinator this year. Greg Roman moved on. A lot of the like sort of system kinds of issues that the Ravens had with Lamar not really throwing to wide receivers and having issues getting the passing game really going. That's a Greg Roman issue that has existed for as long as he's been an offensive coordinator. It happened with, I believe, Kaepernick in San Francisco when he was there. It happens with his teams. So it's not surprising that that was the situation. I think with the new OC there, um, you might see a little bit of a different situation, a little bit of a different offense, and even potentially wide receivers going back to Baltimore as a destination because Baltimore, like you didn't even want to, like receivers didn't even want to sign there because they knew that they weren't going to get utilized in that offense. I think that might change with
Yeah,
a different scheme there.
the last wideout I remember having any impact on their team was Torrey Smith, and that was a long time
Hmm.
ago now.
Still Joe
So,
Flacco there.
yeah, need to bring that back.
Yeah, definitely. But yeah, so going back into the QB conversation though, so with Jimmy G, I think he's definitely gonna be on the move from the Niners as well. I just don't see a situation where he ends back back up with them. I just don't think that makes any sense for either side. I think it'd be really interesting to see him go back to the Patriots. I think that with as much flip flopping as the Patriots did with their QB room last year, Belichick obviously isn't sold on Mac Jones or Zappy or anyone else that's in that QB room. I think he really wanted to keep Garoppolo around back when they traded him initially. I think it'd be interesting to see a Garoppolo and Belichick reunion. I don't know if it's super likely, but I just think that'd be an interesting destination for Jimmy G.
I don't think it's likely because they brought in Bill O'Brien for Mac Jones.
True.
Um, and they traded Jimmy G because of that Tom Brady drama a long time ago. So I
Right.
don't know if they'll ever go back to that because of that. But
Yeah. Yeah. It's a little bit of a long shot for sure. It would just make me really happy. And a Mac Jones, Bill O'Brien versus Bill Belichick, Jimmy G quarterback battle in a training camp would just be really interesting. It would be really, really interesting, I think.
for sure.
But anyway, going into Lamar, I think he's going to stay with the Ravens too. I kind of hinted at that when you were talking about it. With this much roster construction has centered around Lamar Jackson for the Ravens, there's no way they can't sign the guy. If they do, they're going to have to start to rebuild everything in some different ways. So I think they're just going to pay him, and I think he's probably just going to stay with the Ravens. There are a couple of other quarterbacks that are kind of in the mainstream news, and people are wondering about what they're going to do. Uh, Derek Carr, Aaron Rodgers are two names that have come up. What are your predictions for what would happen with those two QB situations?
So when Derek Carr has played with the Raiders, I feel like more times than not, his defense has let him down. They aren't like able to put up enough points. I know he threw a bunch of picks this year, but even in past years, the defense struggled, and that's why they brought in Chandler Jones,
And good
which
quarterbacks try to
still,
compensate.
yeah, still didn't work.
Hmm.
So I think his decision will be based off of the surrounding help, which obviously makes sense for most quarterbacks, but that's where I see him landing with the Saints. They consistently have a top defense and can help provide if Derek Carr is struggling, at least keep him in the game. Because when he was with the Raiders this past year, a bunch of one possession games
Hmm.
um, lost, flip those around, and you're in the playoffs.
Yep.
Um,
Yep.
give him a guy like Alvin Kamara who hasn't been talked about since he got paid, really.
Hmm.
But what are you going to do when Taysom Hill has to play quarterback every now and then and that kind of thing?
Yeah.
So then you also got Chris Olave, young guy. You got a bunch of guys, Mike Thomas, Jarvis Landry. You
Hmm.
have help there. Um, so I believe if he were to go there, you can play in a dome for one. For two, you have help, not
Yeah.
just offense, but defense. So I think that would be the smartest decision for him to make. And I believe he was looking at the Panthers. But with everything I just said, they got rid of McCaffrey. They got rid of a bunch of
Yeah.
guys. I don't think
Yeah.
it's not appealing
Right.
compared to the Saints.
Yeah, the Saints are
So
interesting. The Dome tidbit is especially interesting because he has a horrible record in cold weather. Have you seen some of those stats?
yeah,
Yeah,
real
so I think
bad.
that's interesting. That's an interesting point. And then this is kind of off topic too, but to expand on Derek Carr as a quarterback in general, you mentioned some of the pieces that they'll have in New Orleans. He had pieces in Vegas. He had pieces with the Raiders. He had Devontae. He had Josh Jacobs. I think Josh Jacobs was the highest graded running back by Pro Football Focus this year. So like he had
Yeah.
a really solid offense. Those one possession games. Can you blame the team entirely for them not pulling it out, or at some point do we have to start looking at Derek Carr as more of like a I don't like just not that guy for a franchise?
I don't think it's the fact that he's not that guy. I think it was more Josh McDaniels was trying to change up his play calling to favor Devontae Adams. Darren Waller and Renfro were hurt for a good portion of the year too. And those obviously you're gonna have to lean on Devontae and Josh Jacobs. I think Josh Jacobs did his thing, but
Hmm.
whenever teams got a lead and they had to kind of like hang in there, it was forced to
Yeah,
Devontae Adams over and over again.
yeah. I'll
Um,
give you that
I'm
one. I'll give
sorry,
you that one.
it's not the same combo as Aaron Rodgers and
Yeah,
Devontae. Like, let's be real. I
yeah,
know you're college teammates and all, but you still got to spread the wealth
yeah,
and make the right reads, not just force to a guy that, can make those plays, but not all the time.
yeah, yeah. I'll give you the Josh McDaniels argument too. Would not retain him as a coach, as a
No,
head
I
coach. But
he's a better
anyway,
coordinator.
for sure.
Yeah.
Anyway, the
So
next QB, the other QB, Rodgers. Speaking of Rodgers,
yeah, so I think he'll actually go to the Raiders. So
mm,
I think that's kind of a funny topic. I think he'll reunite with Devontae, and I think if they can find a way to get him in, I think you automatically have to put him at the top of the AFC with the Chiefs. Because obviously you can't count out the Chiefs.
hmm
Um, I guess you have to throw the Bengals in there, but there
yeah,
was talks on they might
Bills.
move T Higgins and stuff too. So we'll see.
That's interesting.
Um,
Yeah.
it was a weird one. But reuniting with Devontae, having Josh Jacobs, which is a top tier running back, which Aaron Jones used to be. I'm not saying he isn't anymore, but I feel like he's kind of fallen off
hmm
this year,
I think so. He's
especially
getting
with
old.
AJ Dillon in the picture and whatnot.
Yeah. And
Yeah,
how old
and
is
running
Aaron
backs usually
Jones?
have a good couple of years. That's a great question. I
He's
think
28.
mid late 20s, and typically,
Yeah.
yeah,
30 years old is most
typically
of the
running
time on
backs
running
start
backs.
falling off.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they'll eventually replace him with AJ Dillon full time. I can see that coming soon. But
hmm
anyway, back to the Raiders. That'll give him a stud tight end. I feel like he hasn't had one for a long time now since his early days with like Jordy Nelson and Randall Cobb being there. I know Randall
Yeah.
Cobb was there this year too, but like
Yeah.
talking way back when they won the Super Bowl.
hmm
Who was their tight end back then? Do you remember?
I was just trying to think. I mean, I like Mercedes Lewis comes to mind.
Nah, that's a recent one. Hold on.
They've always had beefy, like big beefy tight ends. Tunyon had a really good year, but he like hasn't recaptured that success since like that single season where he got over 1,000 yards, I think.
Found the guy I was looking for. Jermichael Finley. There you go.
Finley, yeah, Jermichael Finley, yeah,
So
yeah,
and
yeah.
he was underrated back then. So
hmm
I
Yeah.
know Rodgers, he's not going to an any better defense with the Raiders. Obviously, I just toasted the
Yeah.
Raiders for their defense in regards to Derek Carr's case,
Yeah.
but I feel like he's used to that. But I think Aaron Rodgers makes better reads, and obviously he's a top quarterback for a reason.
hmm
So he'll be able to carry them enough. I just think they need to make offseason moves to
Yeah.
amp up their defense a little bit, and they'll be fine.
I think Aaron Rodgers also has enough weight with his like stature in the NFL that he can go into the Raiders locker room and he's going to be able to make decisions in spite of Josh McDaniels or in spite of whatever coordinator's there that's going to fit, his chemistry with Devontae already or whatever he builds with Waller or Josh Jacobs. He's a good enough player that they're going to do those kinds of things too. Where I'm not sure Derek Carr has that sort of weight to throw around like in the meetings throughout the week. Like Aaron Rodgers is going to do what he wants. I'm not sure Derek Carr is there.
Yeah, and quick thought, that's like when LaFleur first came in and they got into that
Mm-hmm.
little argument. That just shows you right
Yeah,
there. He'll sway it
right.
where he wants to. So
Exactly. Yeah. So my thoughts on those two QBs. Rodgers, we've been talking about a little bit. I do tend to agree. I think there's too much chemistry with him and Devontae to not do that. I think there's those weird stories that came out about Aaron Rodgers going to like a sweat lodge so he could make his decisions and like do these trips and stuff. And I think it's kind of funny, like good for him, like whatever your decision making process is. But I think he ends up at the Raiders. The Raiders can pay him. They're looking for a win now QB with the contracts that they've signed people to over the last couple of years. I don't think Green Bay wants to keep Rodgers around. I think they're ready to move on to that next chapter. I think they're saying the things they have to say right now, but they're ready to move on. So I think he ends up at the Raiders. As far as Derek Carr goes, the Saints are a good pick. I do like the idea of the Saints and being in that dome for like the cold weather parts of Derek Carr, those kind of things. But my pick would be the Jets. I think instead of Jimmy G going to the Jets, I think we could see Derek Carr going to the Jets. I think I saw a report just came out that the Jets came out and said that they think Derek Carr could be a first ballot Hall of Famer if he came to New York. And I don't believe that. Yeah, it's a head scratcher, but it's the typical thing that you see a New York franchise do when
yeah, you're
they
right
have
there.
like a single good meeting and they're trying to make a statement and they want to make a big splash in whatever off season's going on. Like it's very expected that the Jets would say something like that. But I don't think that it won't help sway Derek Carr to go there. Like Derek Carr comes off as the kind of QB to me where like he does want some of those personal accolades. The way that the whole Raiders situation like ended, I feel like there's probably fault on both sides for like the communication and just how that all broke down. It just seems like there's a hint of dysfunctionality, and the Jets. I mean, like I don't know. It just seems like a really good pairing for those
Yeah,
two things
and
to kind of mesh. So,
so when I made my point about Jimmy G going to the Jets, it's because I was talking about Jimmy G being a game manager.
mhm.
So I think with Derek Carr being on the Raiders, he felt like he had to carry the load. Whereas I think him being on a team like obviously I said the Saints or even the Jets, because the Jets had a top defense this year
Yeah,
too.
similar,
They
similar makeup
they
of
just
a
couldn't
team.
they couldn't put points on the board. So
Mhm.
um, I think putting him in a lesser role will help that team
Mhm.
because it'll put a lot less pressure on him.
Yeah.
Defense will put a lot less pressure on him, and I think having young and upcoming guys and not having like a superstar on his team to
Mhm.
focus on or
Yeah.
like a friend to focus
R-
on. Like
Right.
again, I'm not throwing shade at Devonte Adams, but I think that's what their focus was, and I just didn't think that was the
Yeah.
right way to go about it.
Yeah. There's a dynamic there that it's hard to ignore. That that exists, but you have to feel bad for the Jets. It does feel like they've put together a really good defense. It feels like they've put together really a contending team, but there was a stretch of games last year where they just couldn't put up 10 points. Like they couldn't put
Yeah,
up 10 points on the board. I think, the QB for the Jets, the starting QB next season, will most likely not be Zach Wilson. I'd give like a 90% or higher chance that it's not going to be Zach Wilson, but it will be interesting to see which QB ends up there.
Zach Wilson's
But
going to spend his whole offseason texting moms. Go ahead.
yeah, yeah, that could happen. Very, very likely. More likely than him being the starting QB next year. Anyway, going into sort of the next NFL conversation before we transition to some of the NBA things that are going on. The NFL came out with some reports after the Super Bowl that they were going to look to ban the QB sneak with the push from behind. Obviously, the Eagles made it into the Super Bowl this year. They're had a bunch of crazy stats about them successfully completing all these fourth down conversions, all these fourth down and ones, all these QB sneak attempts. They're like 37 of 41 or something crazy like that. And people are arguing that it's just not good for the game for people to be doing QB sneaks in the way that the Eagles were doing them. And to just like explain that like a little bit more, like they basically had just players line up behind the quarterback and they had players push the quarterback from behind instead of just the quarterback trying to like nudge his way through the offense line scrimmage. So you had extra guys pushing from behind. They're trying to outlaw that. Bender, what are your thoughts about them trying to ban that? Like, do you think it's ridiculous? Do you think there's like a real conversation there? Like, what's going to happen with that?
I do think it's a real conversation to have, just considering the success rate that the Eagles had specifically.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I don't think it should be banned. I feel like it's just a part of the game. They utilize utilize to the best of their ability, like different formations and even adding like motion to it.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like they kind of played the system in a way, and I guess like
Yeah.
if those are rules, they're rules. Like I know it was kind of cheesy in a sense to keep like
Mm-hmm.
overusing it, but if you have it, you have it. If you don't, you end up looking like the Bills and Vikings in that game they had earlier in the year. So
Yeah. 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 Definitely. Yeah. I can definitely see the case for not banning it. Like if I'm talking in pure football terms, I'm probably saying no, don't ban it because the exact same argument. It's part of the rules. They're using innovative motion. They're using some different pre-snap kinds of things that are all allowed by the regular rules of football, why not allow them to do that? I think the only argument that I would say that they should ban that kind of a move is because they like the NFL isn't necessarily selling just football. They're selling a product that's meant for like entertainment. And it's
yeah,
not necessarily entertaining to watch the same team line up 40 times in a season and do the same thing to gain a yard. It is impressive that they were that successful with it. I don't think every team is able to do that. Not every team has a Jalen Hurts that squats 600 pounds. So I don't think it's something that can be replicated everywhere. But at the same time, when you're selling that entertainment product, I think it takes away from the entertainment value of those critical kinds of plays in a game. So that would be sort of my take on like maybe why it is worth it to ban it purely from the NFL's entertainment perspective, not necessarily from like a a football perspective.
Yeah, I see where you're coming from. And just to give you a stat on that, I believe I saw 32 times this season, including playoffs. So I think that led the league, I'm pretty sure, as well.
Crazy,
So
crazy.
just to give you an update on that one. So now we're going to start transitioning to some of the NBA. We just passed free agent or not free agency trade deadline, excuse me. Obviously, big moves, Kyrie, KD, bunch of things,
Mhm.
bunch of new things to talk about, especially including the NBA title odds. So that was
Yeah,
updated post trade deadline, and they still have the Celtics at number one, and they still have like the Bucks up there, Nuggets up there, but they have the Suns climbing all the way up to number two now. So, what are your thoughts on NBA title odds? Who do you have?
yeah. Yeah, they've moved around a little bit. Obviously, like every year with the trade deadline, they fluctuate a little bit as all the teams kind of make their last second moves and stuff. I think the Suns have to be the favorite. I understand the Celtics being up in the top, but when you trade for KD and you didn't get rid of Aiton, Booker, or Chris Paul, I feel like you have to be the favorite. I don't see how you're not the favorite. It may take some time to gel. Hopefully, KD gets back on the court and he's healthy and all that is successful. But I don't understand how you don't make the Suns the favorite in that case. I understand the Celtics being there, I understand the Bucks being there, the Nuggets, the Sixers all have sort of good standings with NBA title odds. Grizzlies, I think, are maybe a little bit high, even though I have them as a sleeper team from one of our previous episodes. Not necessarily maybe to win the title, probably to go far, but I don't think the Grizzlies, would have necessarily enough to win the whole thing.
Yeah,
So yeah,
real
it's
quick
been interesting.
question.
Hmm.
Real quick question. Are you worried about the Suns' depth at all since they got rid of all their wing play?
Yeah, I think they did get rid of a lot of shooting with Cam Johnson and Mikal Bridges. I'd be concerned about their defense as well. They don't have too many great perimeter defenders, and I know KD is a great defender, but you got rid of, like you said, a couple pieces. I mean, who else do they have on their bench at this point? I guess
So,
I guess I should be I guess I should be scared about it because you can't name
well,
that
so
many
rumor
people.
has it that Monty Williams will start either Torrey Craig or Josh Okogie, depending on the game um, and the matchup. And those two are defensive specialists and
Hmm.
are getting better and better at like catch and shoot threes. Got to see them here in Indiana against us, and they absolutely destroyed us. I feel like their off-ball movement meshed really well with the current team, and I
Hmm.
think having guys like that will also help ISO guys like KD.
Yeah.
Um, and they just signed Terrence Ross off of buyout, who's also a bucket. A
Hmm.
part of the KD trade was TJ Warren, who's also a bucket. But guess what? We're still not talking about defense. So you have campaign
Yeah.
when healthy. You have the two guys I just mentioned, plus whatever backup center they want to play. That don't really matter. You can always go small ball and see what happens too. The
Yeah.
teams play like that all the time now.
Yeah. KD played your small
So
ball five in Golden State too. You can always do something like that.
yeah, so you have probably eight guys. So that's where I was talking about like, are you worried about depth, especially postseason injuries, that kind of thing? But
Yeah. I mean, that's scary. One guy goes down, you're probably not looking as great. And especially with that roster, you haven't had a lot of good stretch of injury luck in the playoffs. So yeah, and I mean, I don't necessarily sports bet, but if I was a betting man, my money would probably be on the Celtics or the Bucks this year. Seems like the Celtics have everything that they need to go on another title run. From my point
that's
of view, it seems like the Bucks do as well as long as they stay healthy.
that's
I mean, I
crazy.
feel
Go Sixers.
yeah. I mean, hey, like I'm a Sixers fan, and I would love to bet on them, but they've shown Eastern Conference Finals and NBA Finals. I haven't seen the Sixers get out of the second round. So I mean, that's concerning to me. If I was, and again, if I was a betting man, I'm not a betting man,
You're
but
right.
because I'm also very conservative just in general with my money. So like, if I'm going to be very
You're
conservative, I'm
right.
going to take a conservative pick. Like, probably going to take the Celtics. But even in that case, like we're talking about some depth with the Suns and the Celtics and the Bucks, all the teams in the top. It feels like even you could throw the Nuggets and the Sixers and maybe even the Clippers and the Warriors into that conversation now. It feels like you're just throwing a shot at a dartboard to see who's going to stay the healthiest throughout the playoffs.
Yeah, you're right.
Like whoever stays the
Um,
healthiest out of those like top 5 or 6 teams feels to me like they have the best shot.
I see that, and I guess like going off of our conversation, I guess I'll give you my thoughts now. I think
Mhm.
the Clippers need a little bit more respect, especially after getting Russell Westbrook. PG and Russ, when they were back in OKC, had some of their best years together.
Both of them,
Um,
yeah.
so I feel like you shouldn't just look past that. And obviously, you still have Kawhi. But going off of the conversation about the Suns, I asked you about depth, and then you brought up defense. I think the
Hmm.
Clippers have everything. They have depth. Um, I actually saw it today. When your 11th guy is Robert Covington, I think you're in a good place because they
Yeah.
got guys like Norman Powell, Mann, Batum. They have a bunch of guys
Zubac is
that they
still
can
there.
filter in. Yeah, so you have a bunch of guys you can kind of filter in, and having a conversation with some of the Pacers guys, they were talking about the signing with me, and they were talking about like most teams do not like to put their point guard against Russ on defense. So you're going to have mismatches everywhere, whether it's for Russ, for PG, for Kawhi.
Yeah,
And I
true.
think you have two-way players. So people always forget PG and Kawhi play D. So I think if you match up those two guys, like you have Kawhi on KD, obviously it's hard to stop KD in general.
Hmm.
But if you put Kawhi on KD, put PG on D Book, Russell Westbrook's going to give CP fits. I think the only matchup you worry about there is DeAndre Ayton, but I think Zubac is good in his role and can
Yeah.
handle himself.
Yeah.
So I think that's a team that can kind of be a sleeper for the Suns, especially since the Suns have the highest title odds for the West now. I think
Right.
you need to start looking at teams that can compete. I think
Makes
that's the one.
sense. I think that makes sense. I can't argue with any of that logic. Russ and Paul George did have some of their best years together. A lot of ball dominance, but I think the Clippers did need like a pure point guard. I think even Kawhi in the past has mentioned like he enjoys playing with like a pure point guard, like a Kyle Lowry type.
And
It's where
he
he's
wanted one. He said that before
yeah,
the trade deadline.
yeah. So I think a lot of people even talked about how like like oh Paul George and Russ are getting back together, so that's gonna be really good for them. How's Kawhi gonna feel? I think Kawhi is gonna blossom from it too. He plays better when he doesn't have to have the ball in his hands a ton.
Yeah.
He's very different from a lot of the other superstars in the league. Kawhi doesn't want to bring the ball up. I don't think he wants to bring the ball up. But so
Yeah, I think you're going to see Russ like reinvent himself in a way.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
I saw somebody made a comment, I forget where from, but about how Russ played well when he was like the primary ball handler, like playmaker. And then when he started joining teams that didn't really need a primary ball handler, like James Harden on the Rockets, you got LA,
Hmm.
even like I want to say even the Wizards because they had
Hmm.
like Bradley Beal controlling the majority of the time, like that kind of thing. Like he just struggled there, and obviously you're going to struggle on the Wizards. I hate to break it to you, but you just
Yeah,
are.
yeah.
Um, they're getting better, but they don't. I feel like they don't have any identity over there. But
Yeah.
anyway, I feel like if you get him back into his true role, he's going to blossom and look like himself again. I'm not saying triple double, but he might be like 18, 8, and 8, and which is good enough for
Hmm.
two other guys in PG and Kawhi who are going to get like 25 plus.
Yeah. Yeah, it definitely makes them more dangerous and fits in better than I think people are giving it credit for.
Yeah, for sure. So we're going to go into one of our most popular segments here and do rapid fire, and we're going to do NBA version. So Zach is going to ask me a bunch of questions, and I have to give real quick answers within a minute's time, and might be some hot takes. You never know, but
Yeah, hopefully today there will be. We have a couple of questions that are just all over the place. So there's no specific theme for these rapid fire questions today. But yeah, we could jump into it. Bender, whenever you're ready, you can give me a nod.
I'll let you know in just a second and set this up. All right, you can go ahead whenever.
Okay, the first question. Where will Bronny get drafted to? Just came out today that he's projected to be a top 10 pick in the 2024 draft.
Uh, Pistons.
Pistons. Okay, good pick. Now, follow-up question to that. Will LeBron follow him?
No,
So LeBron will not go play for the Pistons.
no.
Okay. Next question. Did you see the story about Ben Simmons and the 20K free throw bet during a Wizards Sixers game? What is your hot take about that situation?
First of all, he's tripping and doing everything to himself at this point.
Yeah. So for those who don't know, Ben Simmons was tired of the Wizards fouling him, and he said that he was going to bet $5,000 in him making a free throw, and he missed it after Bradley Beal said, "How about 20,000?" So that's unfortunate for Ben Simmons. Okay, next question. All-Star viewership is down, Bender. How would you change the format, or how would you encourage more competition from the All-Star game? How would you change it to make it better? I think everyone's complaining about it.
I think there needs to be more incentive. I think they need to increase the amount of money they would earn for winning versus losing.
Mm,
I like the quarter by quarter and then the game total idea, but I think the NBA has enough money to throw around to make that change and give their like more excitement or more motivation
mm,
for the players. And I feel like the only way to do that is money because
yeah,
obviously with their careers on the line at any point, it's all about how much money they're going to make.
yeah,
Um,
true, true.
so
Good
and
point.
and
Good point.
that's last question.
Cool. All
Time
right,
is up.
let's do one more question. One more question because I think you're gonna like this one.
I guess I'll allow it.
All right, one more question. Load management has been being talked about a lot recently. Is it the biggest issue the NBA has right now? I especially wanted to ask you this because you are close to that situation, being, an intern as a trainer for one of the teams. So, yeah, curious to hear your insight on that specific question.
I personally think it's the biggest problem for the NBA,
Hmm.
but I think it's in the case of viewership, not for the players. So depends on how you want to look at it. So I think a lot of times the players have every right to sit out because if you have some kind of, let's say, bone bruise or something, and you go out and play, and let's say you get kicked in that spot or fall on it again or anything of that sort, that could lead to weeks.
Hmm.
Like, so if you're missing weeks of games and instead of one at that point, because maybe, or
Hmm.
one or two, maybe,
Right.
um, and obviously it depends on how much excuse me like movement you have, pain tolerance, that kind of thing. Every individual has their own kind of pain tolerance, so
Hmm.
I feel like you have to take different like variables into account.
Yeah.
However, I want the players to try and play as much as possible. I think it would help their contract situation
Hmm.
because if you start missing too many games, people start looking at that differently.
Right.
Unless you're like an MVP guy, like they're not going to yell at LeBron for missing games, like that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. It's such a
so
situational thing, but kind of like what you're saying. That's what makes it difficult because on a player to player basis, the only person that really knows if they're able to go or not, or if it's going to cause some other sustained injury, is the player. So how are you going to make that equal across the entire league for every situation, for every night? Like it's not going to happen.
and I agree with Anthony Edwards' comments in regards to they might only have the money for this one ticket to come out and see
Yeah.
you. That might never happen again. Like everyone's money situation is different. So that's where
Hmm.
I think the players should play as much as possible for viewership and fan reasons,
Yeah.
but also their contract reasons. Obviously, contract reasons can be are you injury prone or not as well.
Hmm.
So if you're trying to save yourself because you know a big contract's coming up, kind of thing, then do what you got to do. You can't really
Yeah.
feel like it's hard to play 82 games anymore anyway, unless you're Michael
Hmm.
Bridges or Buddy Hield.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
um,
Well, and in the NBA, it's so tough too because it's 82 games versus it makes me think of Lamar sitting out the rest of the year in the NFL, even though they play way less games. Like it's prevalent in all sports leagues, but if you're gonna play 82 games in a season, you're gonna have star players sit out sometimes. Yeah, I mean, tough situation
yeah,
to get around.
Demar made a comment, I believe, in the last couple of days about you should
Mm,
play minimum 78 games,
for
which I
MVP,
think is I think that yeah for MVP, I think that's ridiculous. I think it should be maybe like 66,
yeah, it's like
but
65, 66. Yeah,
because you will miss a couple of games here and there. Like if you're Jalen Brown and get hit by your own teammate, you're gonna miss time.
yeah,
So
yeah,
like things just happen.
yeah.
But this was another episode of Life in the Stands podcast. We will have another one coming out next week, so stay tuned for that and start talking about more free agency and trade stuff for football. And we're getting closer to NBA playoffs, so just keep an eye and see what happens. Thank you guys.